So, hello everyone, welcome to this episode of SNEED-CAST. We're your hosts, Alexa and Q. Today we are here with Jessica Infante, who is the managing editor over at Brewbound. Hello, Jessica. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And today we're going to be talking all things craft brewing industry related. We're going to be talking about the overall health of the industry, as well as the employment, opportunities for growth, and any advice that you may have at the end for us.
Yeah, so Jessica, so we work in the date coding world, and so we have a lot of clients who are small craft or a small craft brewery. So we just kind of want to get your insight on this. And first things first, I guess, kind of the elephant in the room is that the craft beer world is kind of in a weird decline right now. And we just kind of want to get like an opening thought or statement on that of like the overall health and what has kind of led, to this place where from the boom of 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really interesting way to frame this up because craft beer, unfortunately, has had its first decline outside of COVID in volume ever since the Brewers Association was recording these numbers. In 2023, craft beer did, there was less craft beer made and sold than there was the year before. And the only time that's ever happened was 2020, which we all know was kind of a weird year. But COVID aside, there's a lot of different things at play in the market that are affecting craft brewers at the moment. And the other thing that you've got to think about when you think about craft beer is that it's such a big tent. There are the large regional breweries. You have, the Sam Adamses, the Sierra Nevadas of the world, who have much different business needs than, say, your local neighborhood tapper. So that all of these companies are part of the same industry is really quite interesting because their needs are different, their challenges are different, their opportunities are really different. But globally, there's really a turn toward moderation for drinkers. People are just drinking less for a lot of reasons, but many of them being health and wellness. And I think people don't always think of craft beer as being one of the healthiest things you can consume. And that's certainly true of, say your pastry stouts and your triple IPAs. I don't think anybody would think this is a smart caloric choice for me with one of those beers, but there are options and there's light lagers are starting to have a moment, which I think is part of this. So that was a really long-winded way to say stuff's weird right now. And I think we're about to turn the corner into a new phase of craft, whatever that might look like.
Gotcha. And so, you mentioned COVID. Are there still lingering effects from that? Like, because I know, like, around me, there are lots of breweries that, their whole draw is, hey, come here, have a beer with your friends and socialize. Are there still effects of that going on? Like, what is your perspective on the lingering effects from that?
Yeah, the biggest impact that COVID has had on craft beer is the loss of tap lines. So, think back to March and April of 2020 when, at least, I normally spend most of the year in Massachusetts and all of our restaurants were completely shut down. So during that time, a lot of these bars and restaurants realized like, hey, maybe I don't need 60 draft lines. Maybe I don't need 40 draft lines. Maybe I don't need 20 draft lines. And a lot of these venues started to cut their draft lines in half or by 20%. And the problem there is that craft beer is heavily over-indexed to on draft. About 30% of all draft beer consumed in this country is craft. And that is not, when you think of on the whole how much craft beer accounts for all of the beer that we drink, it is not anywhere near 30%. So craft is super, super exposed to the on-premise element. And really it's not seen that those lines are coming back. Most of the businesses that made the decision to get rid of their draft lines are sticking with it. And I understand it. Draft lines are you have to maintain them. And if you don't, you get problems, but they're work to maintain. It's worth it. I think that the margins are really good on the draft side of things, but I think a lot of restaurateurs saw it as being a little bit of an expense or a nuisance that they didn't necessarily want to deal with as much as they have been. So that's a huge, huge loss for craft beer.
Gotcha. And then to kind of touch on something you said kind of like a health thing. I myself personally, 10 years ago, I was drinking a lot of craft beer myself. I was trying to find the darkest port, the stoutest stout, and I don't know if it's just in my age or if it's an actual more documented thing is that I just much prefer a light beer now. I've seen craft breweries around me. They are making almost like a version of like Michelob Ultra or a version of Bud Light. So is it, can you kind of speak to maybe the, I don't know, thirst for these more light beers? Is there something that happened that like kind of led to that? Because it seems sudden, you know?
I don't want to upset you, but Hugh, I'm assuming based on what you've just said that you and I might be about the same age.
I'm 29 right now. So
Okay, never mind. I am 39.
I look older. Oh, okay.
But yeah, so the thing is, like craft's core drinkers are getting older. Millennials are getting older. And so you're a tail end millennial. I'm like an elder millennial. I have seen the term Spice Girls generation used, and frankly, I would prefer that. But we're getting old. We can't drink as much as we used to for a lot of reasons. You know, there's the health of it, the calorie aspect. There's that, but there's also people are just drinking less alcohol. So craft's core drinkers are millennials and Gen X, and we're all aging. And that your what you want to spend your money on changes as you get older. And I know the daycare bill is really my craft beer habit is no match for the daycare bill. So, there's a lot of different things at play. But you're right. Michelob Ultra is a hugely popular beer, and there are a lot of breweries that are seeing the success that it's had. It's not an overnight success, though. AB really launched Mich Ultra the way it is 20 plus years ago. And they've put a lot of money behind it. And what I've started to notice in the past year, and this doesn't really pertain to craft, although it kind of does, is that AB, Anheuser-Busch InBev, really started focusing a lot more of their sports marketing efforts around Mich Ultra than Bud Light. So I'm sure you saw the Super Bowl commercials, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the Mich Ultra commercials with Serena Williams. I'm sure there are many other famous sports people whose names are escaping me. But like that's really the way that AB has positioned that brand as being the health and wellness and better for you. And craft brewers have noticed that, and they've seen success, and they know that they've got customers who value them as independent brewers. And, if they could get a beer like that from their preferred independent brewer, they will. So that's something that I think a lot of breweries are latching on to right now.
So I actually have a question, Gen Z here. Is there anything that the craft brewing industry is doing to attract, younger generations or even different demographics such as women, minorities?
So I'm really glad you brought that up, because just today I published, our timing for this conversation is really, really great, because last week the Brewers Association they do an annual drinker poll, and they shared all of that data last week. And one of the things that I found really interesting was, they had surveyed thousands of drinkers. And one of the things that they asked people was, of these, attributes of an alcoholic beverage product, what's most important to you? And what the primarily Gen Z age group, the 21 to 34, like when you've got to start at 21, it's hard to parse down to what I would say Gen Z is probably what, like right now, the 21 to about 27, 28 for legal drinking age consumers. Yeah. One of my teammates, my coworker, Zoe Licata, is she's kind of right around where you guys are. She's like a cusper. So it's really interesting to always get her thoughts on this. But anyway, this survey asked drinkers of all ages, what is the most important? And the way that the team at the Brewers Association broke down this data was they shared that the 21 to 34-year-old age cohort, the thing that they thought was more important than the other age groups, it's not to say that they think it's more important than anything else, but they were the age group that valued this the most, was appearance and packaging, which was really interesting to me. And the number of them that selected appearance and packaging as being very or somewhat important was 34% higher than the response of the age group that checked it less frequently. So I'm kind of like garbling these words because it's like a really complicated way to share data, but it does make sense.
No, it does, yeah.
Right. That was interesting to me. Another thing that kind of resonated on my end a little bit, knowing myself as a drinker and my, my peers, was that millennials seem to be really more into if a beer is locally made and its ingredients, they selected those things more than other age groups. And I think something that really has kind of happened was that local was really important to the millennials. It is not as important to Gen Z. What Gen Z routinely tells us is more important is a company's values. So I think where a lot of craft breweries were able to take off in, the past, like, call it 10 years, was because people were super into local. And you basically just had a brewery opening up in every zip code. I can tell you my hometown of Salem, Massachusetts, we have 3 breweries, which is crazy because we only have 45,000 people. But that was really important to those drinkers. The younger drinkers are way more into mission, values, community. So what you're starting to see happen is there are quite a few brewers throughout the country, and I can highlight a few if you guys are interested, that are doing a really good job at speaking to these groups that didn't see themselves reflected in craft beer before. The stereotype that everybody has in their head when they think of craft beer is a scruffy bearded white guy in a flannel.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, people think of me and like yeah, it's Frank, and I'm like what's the IPA you have? Sometimes stereotypes happen, and but go on, sorry.
But no, I mean, it's a stereotype for a reason, and we'll get into. Yeah. I'll totally go down that rabbit hole for you. But some breweries that I can think of off the top of my head that are doing a really great job at speaking to other people is Crowns and Hops out in Inglewood, California. Look them up if you haven't. Crowns and Hops is founded by. They're friends of mine. So Benny Ashburn and T.O. Hunter, and T.O.'s an Army veteran. Benny's a woman. They're both Black. So it's a Black-owned, veteran-owned, woman-owned craft brewery. And they really bonded their friendship over being Black people who are into craft beer, even though they didn't really see themselves reflected in the community. And they hung out at a lot of breweries. And eventually they were like, we need to do this on our own. And that's what they did. They've done an awesome job. They do a lot of work with HBCUs. They've done a lot of work. They have their own initiative called the 8 Trill Pills Initiative that works to promote entrepreneurship in the Black community and working to close the economic gap. It's there. I can't speak highly enough of them, but something that they just did a couple months ago was pair up with Full Circle up in Northern California. And they formed this platform called the Circle of Crowns Beverage Group to create there's no equity exchange here. There's no ownership. Sorry, guys. I know I'm getting into one of your other questions.
You're fine. No, please, right. No, please go.
Great. So something that Benny and Tio and Arthur Moyer, who owns Full Circle is the biggest brand in his platform, but he also owns Speakeasy, Ales and Lagers, Sonoma Cider, and then they teamed up with Crowns and Hops to create the Circle of Crowns Beverage Group. And this is a collaborative platform where they're able to pool their resources and, use the same sales team, probably use similar facilities and just, share costs of ingredients and costs of other necessary goods. And that's something that's really been helping, but they're really good at speaking to their own communities and really making sure that they feel welcome. Somebody else that does this on the East Coast is Talea in New York City. Talea is founded by 2 different women, Tara and Leanne, and I completely space on their last names, and I am sorry to them, but Talea is the combination of their first names. And I've been to a Talea tap room. It is the antithesis of what you think of being a stereotypical craft beer tap room. It's bright, it's airy, it's welcoming. There are purse hooks under the bar. Like, it's someplace that I could really see myself as a woman hanging out. And they're really great at making sure that everybody feels welcome in the space. They also do a lot of work with fruited sours because that's a really great style of beer that wine drinkers can understand. It's a great way to bring new drinkers into the fold. And then one more I'll just shout out is Lady Justice in Colorado. They are an LGBTQ plus owned craft brewery that's done a really great job of being really welcoming to that community in terms of, beers that they donate proceeds from to related causes, to tap rooming events and programming. It's just really about making sure that people who don't see themselves in the broader craft brewery community that we think of the past, giving them a home and making sure that they feel welcome. A way that breweries can do this without, overhauling their brands is hiring people from these groups. The best way to really get insight on how to speak to a consumer base is to have people from that consumer base on your staff. So there's that, there's making sure your tap room feels really welcoming. I'll give you one, personal anecdotal example. As we just talked about, I recently-ish became a mom, and one of the breweries in our town where we spend all of our time, or a lot of our time, is Notch Brewing. And one thing that they have done is making sure that there's a baby changing station in the men's room. There's one in the women's room, which is a given, but, there's one in the men's room, which is awesome. It's nice to be able to go there to know. And I won't have to be on, diaper change duty for everyone because my husband can take care of it too.
Yeah, and to speak to the experience part of it, I can directly think because I like to go to these craft spots, and I would take my wife there, and she drinks white wine mostly. She's not too into it, and I took her to a place that was a warehouse that had bench seats, beer, some like bar games, and then they had one white wine on the thing. And she looked at me and she was like, "What? Like why am I here? Like this is really lame." And I was like. And at first I was like, oh, come on, like, be cool. But then I was like, wait, well, this is like not a very fun experience for someone who isn't into beer. It's just like there's beer and a bench. Like, this is not the most fun place to be, So
Yeah.
that's great to hear that there are places trying to be bright, trying to have other options too.
Honestly, I'm impressed that they had a white wine at all. So
There's a lot here that they've wisened up some, but I still think there's probably, they could have more options probably, but who knows? Yeah.
Well, and legally, that's not possible in every state. I'm actually kind of impressed that Texas is allowing breweries to serve other things. Like, that's awesome. Like in Massachusetts, that's not allowed.
Oh, really? Well, I know Massachusetts has some weirdly, because you guys can't have like a happy hour and stuff like that too, right? Or something like that.
Not happy hour. It is really sad.
Yeah, I recently learned that, and that blew my mind. But then I heard about the laws behind it. It kind of makes sense. But yeah, anyways. So to speak on staffing, like, has there been has there been a struggle to fill these spots?
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I've heard, from brewers that I talk to either for stories as sources or that I'm friends with, they do have a hard time hiring, especially lately. And when you really look at these jobs, they're either mostly hospitality jobs or manufacturing jobs. And these are hard physical labor at times, and nobody gets into craft beer to get rich, and for the most part, nobody is. So, pay can be kind of low. It's what I like to think of as being a passion industry, where it's people think like, hey, it's cool to work here. We work in beer, so much fun, but the pay doesn't always reflect that. So, yeah, I think a lot of breweries have been having a hard time filling roles. That's just kind of what I've been hearing out there in the market.
Yeah, and that's not something that's specific to craft beer. There's so many stories of folks having issues finding help and all that stuff, and there's things to be said about that. But to touch on another thing, and sorry I keep jumping around, but
No, please.
So what I've noticed a lot is like you see a lot of these seltzer brands popped up, and I think since COVID that's really been popping up of like it seems like every beverage brand now has their like seltzer brand that's also alcoholic. And do you think and while we would think that wouldn't affect the craft beer world, it has to have, right, in some way? Or do you think there's
a little bit?
Yeah.
So the that drinker survey that I mentioned that the Brewers Association posted last week really showed that craft beer drinkers are so Bart Watson, who's the chief economist of the Brewers Association, also their VP of strategy, I think he coined this word because he's the only person I've really ever heard say it, but the word omnibibulous, which means you drink a lot of different things. You drink across categories. And this is kind of a recent development. It used to be that a beer drinker was a beer drinker, a wine drinker is a wine drinker, and a spirits drinker is a spirits drinker. And today, mostly wine and spirits drinkers are still kind of sticking to their own stuff, but beer drinkers are drinking everything. So beer drinkers were drinking hard seltzer. Hard seltzer is an interesting case right now. I think it really boomed in 2020 and 2021 and then it started to decline a lot. I think what you said, the market got really flooded. And, I think what we're going to see, I don't think it will go away, but I do think we'll never see those levels again. And I think it's going to land on being a segment that just has a couple big players, namely, White Claw, which is from Mark Anthony Brands, and Truly Hard Seltzer, which is from Boston Beer. But I'm sure you guys see it in Texas. Topo Chico Hard Seltzer probably does pretty well. One thing that hard seltzer does have going for it is its alcohol base. So some states, in some cases, there's control states where the state government is who's selling mostly wine and spirits, and beer is available to be sold at grocery stores. In places like that, hard seltzer gets in at the grocery store level because it is considered a beer by its alcohol base. So we're starting to see some legislative pushes on that front, where some states, Pennsylvania and North Carolina recently made it easier for spirits-based canned cocktails, like say a High Noon, which is vodka, for those to be sold outside of the state stores and grocery stores. But hard seltzer is really like a good answer to that problem because it is fermented cane sugar. It's considered a beer by tax and by law. So I don't really think we're going to see those big boom levels again. And I think a lot of breweries, I think right around when I started my job at Brewbound in 2019, a lot of craft breweries were launching seltzer brands, and many, many, many of them have backed away because they're hard to make. And if people can find it somewhere else, that's probably what they'll do. So I think that's really freed up breweries to focus on other things.
That makes a lot of sense.
I actually have a question.
Sure.
Because this is a topic that we do talk about here on our segment, Industry Update. Whenever brands infuse, like, say, THC and CBD into their craft brew creations, is the industry seeing that as a threat, or what's their take on that?
Great question. Sentiment is really mixed. There are some breweries that see this as a huge opportunity. And there are some breweries that are kind of shying away from it for legal reasons because they think legally it's able to be done, but there's a lot of, different, like, I don't want to call them loopholes because that's probably not right, but it's a little nebulous and it's a little fuzzy. In some states, though, it's really been able to take off. For example, in Minnesota, their state legislature didn't even really realize what they were doing, but they legalized THC drinks a couple of years ago. And these drinks are all non-alcoholic, but they are infused with THC. And there's a few states where it's taken off. Like I know we've been covering the situation in Iowa pretty closely, where there's a few brands that have been able to make these THC infused drinks and sell them at regular retail, which, and the state all of a sudden kind of thought, hey, wait a minute, let's pause this. And right now that's tied up in lawsuits. So it's interesting because I think the broader, conventional wisdom is that Gen Z drinkers in particular don't really see a difference. They don't really see beer is beer and wine is wine and spirits are spirits and THC is this. They kind of are able to see across categories. And that makes sense. When you think about the boom that we've had in the last 5 years of canned cocktails, things that are portable and convenient like a beer is, but they use spirits, everything kind of gets a little blurry for them. And I know the major trade orgs would absolutely disagree with what I am saying here. But I think these, 21 to 25-year-old drinkers, to them, they just kind of see a drink.
Well, and to speak on the state stuff, here in Texas, that's a big thing right now. There's a huge company, which I don't know if you've seen it all. There was a brewery here called Eighth Wonder Brewery. And they got bought out by Bayou City Hemp. And that was a pretty huge deal, I think, because it's in Texas where the farm bill happened, and now the weed or THC, is essentially legal in the state here. And this is a state here where the legislators are pretty pissed about it because it was a loophole, and they've gone on record being very, very, very mad about it. And it seems like a huge risk, but this is a huge company that has big aspirations, and they're in specs, which is huge down here, and then they're huge in total wine and more. So they're getting penetration in Texas of all states, where I can't tell you when I think THC would be actually fully legally legalized. So it's just an interesting trend. Rather.
It is interesting. In Massachusetts, we have had legal weed for a while. I want to say 2018 maybe, and maybe late 2017. But I haven't been in a liquor store in a while, so maybe don't quote me on that. But yeah, it is interesting to see where it's popping up in states where you would never expect, like Texas, like Iowa. And it's really interesting. I know Eighth Wonder was a big pioneer in this. I want to say they launched a THC seltzer in 2021, which is a super long time ago. The impact, it's really interesting to see because one of the largest craft beer platforms, and we can get into this, but a huge trend at the top levels of craft beer is these platforms that, a bunch of brands come together, and one of the largest breweries in the country largest craft breweries in the country is actually Tilray. And Tilray is a Canadian cannabis company that got really interested in US craft beer. They acquired Sweetwater out of Atlanta in 2020, and they've just kept adding to their portfolio. They, I want to say, are the sixth largest craft brewery in the country. And their CEO has been pretty explicit in saying, hey, our plan eventually is to create cannabis infused drinks in the US using our craft beer brands and to bring those American craft beer brands to Canada where we're based. But they just, without federal legalization of cannabis in the US, they can't really do the first part of that plan. So they're just chugging along. They actually bought up a ton of craft brands from Anheuser-Busch. Last summer while I was on maternity leave, it was like the one beer story that I, like, my ears perked up and I was like, what the heck is happening here? So everybody's just kind of waiting out federal legalization.
Yeah, I mean, it's great. I mean, I remember hearing the story about Eighth Wonder here, and they were no small potatoes within the city of Houston. So hearing that story to me was, alarming is not the right word, because it's not alarming to me. It was more ear-raising, or as you said, it's super fascinating. I have just one more question, and it goes back to the breweries that you mentioned, which I forgot their name, Crown something, where they have sort of like almost like an allyship or like an alliance. That recently happened here in Houston too, with 3 separate breweries that are all across town, and it sounds fairly similar. So my question is, do you think that's the way forward for all these spots, for these craft breweries?
Yeah, I do. And I actually wrote about those 3 breweries this morning. So I'm happy you brought it up. But yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more of that. So, when you look at the top 10 largest craft breweries by volume in the US right now, they're houses of brands. So there's Boston Beer, which is Samuel Adams and Dogfish Head, and a bunch of other non-beer brands. Duvel USA, which is Firestone Walker Brewery, Omegang, and Boulevard out of Missouri. Gambrinus, which is actually the parent company of Shiner, which you guys, I'm sure, know very well, and a California brand called Trumer. There's Tilray, which has a host of brands like we just talked about, and ABV, which is another collective of mostly East Coast-based brands, and then Monster, which got into craft brewing by acquiring Canarchy, which was another house of craft beer brands. Mostly its biggest brands are Cigar City, Oscar Blues, and Deep Ellum, close-ish to you guys. I think that's really what the future is going to be. I think it's going to be, it's safety in numbers. It's the ability to share resources. It's the ability to get bigger purchasing power, which will help you secure better contracts. And those are some of the biggest, but we talked about, Circle of Crowns in California. That's a smaller example, and no equity was exchanged there. They're just really forming a partnership. But there are other, equity exchanging situations, like something called Indie Brew, which is the combination of Scofflaw Brewing out of Georgia, Bearded Iris out of Tennessee. There's the Houston breweries, 11 Below, Fortress, and B52.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, like people, I think they're just finding their buddies.
Well,
Because the thing is, go ahead.
Well, it's funny. It's like I saw those breweries, and then I was like, I like all those breweries, so that's great for me. Like, hey, cool, works out.
Yeah, and I think the way that they put it in their press release is we are just going to carry on business as usual, but you'll be able to see all 3 brands at all 3 tap rooms. And I think drinkers are starting to appreciate this. Like we talked about before we really, started recording, that attitude of my favorite brewery got sold, they're dead to me forever, that's really gone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
I think people just realize that their favorite breweries, when they get investment, are just going to be able to have the financial support that they need to survive.
Yeah.
Since we are talking about brewery survival and sticking together, safety in numbers, what kind of other advice would you have for, say, like startup breweries? Since we do work with a lot of like mom and pop shops or individuals that are like starting out of their homes, what kind of advice would you give to them going forward?
That's a great question. So what I really kind of see as being super interesting to me right now is that drinker survey we've talked about. One of the questions that they had fielded to people who, there's like, of the survey, there were, of the people who drink alcohol, 30% of them don't drink craft beer. And of that group of people, half of them said it's because they don't like the flavor of craft beer, which to me is interesting because craft beer is really different. So to me, that sounds like maybe these people need a little bit more education in what craft beer is and can be. I think, I hate walking into a tap room and seeing, if they've got 15 taps, 14 of them are IPAs. I know that's if you look at the numbers, that looks like it's what sells. But if you're really trying to create a diverse and well-rounded experience for your customers, give them different beers. But the other thing is quality. I think this is super important. I'm sure we've all been to a brewery and had a beer that probably wasn't as good as it could be. I think those are table stakes in this situation. You really competition is tough right now. Breweries are closing at much higher rates than they have been in the past. And I think really what you need to do is make sure you're putting something out in the market that you're proud of, that meets all your standards. And you can't just, if you know something's wrong, push it out the door and cross your fingers. Up in New England a couple of weeks ago, the Maine Beer Company had been getting ready for a release of, I believe, one of their really specialty beers that they almost never make called Double Dinner IPA. And in their last minute, quality testing, they realized something was wrong and they dumped the entire batch. That I'm sure is a huge financial hit for them, and that sucks.
Yeah.
But that's really important to do.
That's crazy. Well, Jessica, I could talk to you probably for hours and hours about this stuff.
All right, let's have a Zoom happy hour soon.
Yeah. I can't thank you enough for jumping on here and giving us your super awesome info. So thank you so much.
Thank you
so much, Jessica. This was definitely very enlightening to me, just because I'm not too big in the world of craft brewing. So this is great information. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, guys. This was my pleasure.
And then folks can find you with Brewbound, right?
Is it
Yeah, we're at
brewbound.com?
Brewbound.com. You can catch our weekly podcast wherever you listen to podcasts.
Oh, and what's it called? Brewbound as well, or?
The Brewbound Podcast. We're
Cool.
real creative.
Yeah.
Hey, same here. We are the SNEED-CAST, so nothing crazy.
It's just the easiest thing.
Of course. Well, thank you everyone for joining us on this episode of SNEED-CAST. Thank you, Jessica, once again for being here on the show. And remember that you can stream us on all of your favorite streaming platforms. Like always, leave a like, comment, subscribe, and we'll see you guys on the next episode. Thank you, everyone.